YouTube channel. Wonderful. Okay, so now to introduce our guests. The Reverend Dr. Edwin Van Driel is the Director's Bicentennial Professor of Theology at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, where he teaches Christology, ecclesiology, and the relationship between biblical studies and theology. He is the author of several books, including, and I think most recently, The Incarnation as God's First Intention, Supralapsarian Christology for Faith and Practice, which is published by Baker Academic. His current research explores Christology and the church's calling in a post-Christian world. Edwin is an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA and an active member of the Pittsburgh Presbytery. Joining him is the Reverend Kendra Buckwalter Smith. She serves as the director of the worship program at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and as associate pastor for discipleship at the Shadyside Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh. She's an active member of the Presbyterian Association of Musicians, leading PAM's First Call community for ministers and musicians. She is an accomplished preacher, worship leader, and teacher, known for equipping students and congregations to lead faithful, thoughtful, and hospitable worship. Good evening, Edwin and Kendra.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. So to begin our conversation, I really want to begin with the why question. So, stepping back a second, this conversation is based on a series of podcasts that you did, engaging ministry leaders in the Dutch context, looking at, what is church life like in a growing secular society. And you talk about the podcast like this, you say, podcast with stories from the Dutch church for the sake of the North American missional conversation. So I just want to begin by asking, why this podcast? Why a podcast learning from the Dutch context? Why do you think that, the religious landscape of the Netherlands is something that we can learn from?
Yeah, well, the Netherlands is one of the most secularized countries in the West. The church there now being really fully on the margins of society. And so realistically, it's about a generation or two ahead of the US in terms of secularization, which means that in exploring the Dutch context and having conversations with leaders there, we're able to catch a glimpse of what may well be in store for us, where we might be headed in this context. And then to be able to learn the way that leaders there are living and serving in the midst of that reality and kind of catch some imagination from them. So I think in our own context, as we were talking about earlier, we're finding a great deal of anxiety and even some despair around the consequences of secularization, right? We were just talking about aging membership and diminishing resources and cultural marginalization, right? So the church experiencing less and less impact and influence on the culture around them. And so it's hard to see in that context what could come next for us, which is always hard, but especially when our imagination is shaped only by what we've known in the past. And I think seemingly our response has been either to try to hold on to certain approaches to recreate the glory days, as it were, and refill our pews with old structures of programming. And then we end up facing further disappointment, right, when it doesn't quite work and the pews aren't filled. Or in some circles, just to try something completely new, which I think we're finding in a lot of like church planting efforts and new church developments, that they go one of two ways. Either they end up falling back into patterns that they've always known and end up confronting the same sorts of discouraging challenges as established churches. Or they kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and maybe disregard or pave over some of the distinctives of what it means to be Christ's church, such that it becomes unrecognizable and then actually ends up feeding into this trajectory of secularization. And so we were curious about what the Dutch church has to offer to that context, what insights, what new inspiration. In that context, they've really at this stage had to let go of any aspiration to reclaim what once was. And so they're instead drawing on new creative impulses as they explore what it means to be church and reach out to neighbors in this secularized reality. But what we found time and again, and we'll talk about, is that they are resting in ancient church practices to do so, and kind of reclaiming some of these traditional practices. And so a lot of it is really hopeful that there is life after death, a reminder that of that truth, and that the realities in which we currently find ourselves, the realities of secularization, don't get the final word. Rather that God remains faithful to God's promises, and that God is doing a new thing, whether we are ready to perceive it or not. And I think that learning from the Dutch context offers us the opportunity to already step beyond some of the anxiety and despair that we might be wrestling with, and instead to participate in that new thing. And orient ourselves towards a new future with hope and trust and assurance.
Yeah, so what I'm, maybe hearing you say is, right, that in some ways the American church has blinders on, almost like we're stuck in our own sort of world, and we think our own world of the church is the only world that exists. But that may be opening our eyes a little bit, has opportunities to show us hope and give us a path forward, not artificial, but maybe to recognize where God is working already in the world, and put our eyes at that horizon. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
At some level.
Yes.
Okay. Well, Edwin, you come from the Dutch context. You are Dutch yourself, and you teach of course, in the American context. Is there anything, as you came to approach this, you're sort of coming from the context to American church, and then now going, in this process, going back and looking, is there any, gleanings from that in terms of how it's changed, how how the Dutch context has changed, how you've seen the American context mirror some of those things, and we'll get deeper into that. But
Sure, yeah. Well, I think that when I left the Netherlands, which is now 26 years ago, that was as Kendra said, I think that the United States is probably a generation or two behind the developments in the Netherlands. And so that means that where the Netherlands then was, is I think where a lot of places are now, right? Lots of anxiety, lots of trying to get back what you once had. And that the difference I see is that secularization process has accelerated, so that the church now truly is at the margin of society. But that in that, because they have in those 25 years they have embraced this fact, they have let go of trying to get back at stuff, that created space for new creativity, right? When once you can let go of the anxiety, then suddenly new possibilities come up. And the other thing I have seen in that is that so most of the people we interviewed in the podcast come from the Protestant Church in the Netherlands, which is the national church in the Netherlands. So most European countries have a national church, right, which is a foreign concept to United States. But you will know, like, England has the Church of England, right? And Scandinavian countries usually have a Lutheran national church. And so similarly in the Netherlands is a national church. And that means it's a very broad church with a conservative wing, a liberal wing, not dissimilar to, let's say, the PCUSA. And that when I left 26 years ago, there was a strong polemic between those two wings. Certainly around questions of evangelism, right? That was something that was the right wing would do evangelism, the left wing would do diaconate and those kind of things. Secularization has meant that has changed radically. That is, the church as a whole has realized wherever we are theologically, we believe that the gospel has some meaning. We believe that Jesus makes some difference. And we may parse differently what exactly we think that difference is, right? And we may use different language to speak about the gospel or about Jesus, but actually what holds us together as a church is much more important than and as much right than that in which we differ. And the liberal wing of the church has really embraced the fact that if the church wants to survive, or maybe better, if the gospel really means something, that they're gonna have to get into the business of communicating what this is, right? And so the difference between those wings, I have seen disappearing, and I think we got witness of that when we talked with folks and both in the podcast and when we visited. And so the unity of the church actually has grown because of that. And so that also is I think actually a somewhat hopeful thing. I mean, I think that might be good for us to embrace as well.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Definitely. I wonder if, for people here, when you said, you talked about a national church, and I think people maybe can grasp that concept a little bit, but I wonder if you could just talk about how that's really different than sort of denominationalism as we know it in the US.
Sure. So I think American denominationalism at heart is the idea that churches are voluntary organizations that we join or leave at will, right? Even if you're born Presbyterian, the fact that you're part of this or that local congregation, we often see as our choice. And it's also a fact that within the American context, more than half of members within the main line are now a member of a denomination that they were not born in. So there is a lot of transition from denomination to denomination, and then often there is a lot of transition from congregation to congregation. When you move to another place, what do? You go church shopping. You go check out a couple of different congregations and you go see like which one fits me best, but theologically or liturgically, whether you like the worship, whether you like the choir program, whether they have the right program for your children. And that also means that there may be a different phase in life when your kids have left the house. You no longer need this particular church. You go to another kind of church, right? And so it's a voluntary kind of choice to be part of a local community. And also that puts on us the onus that, how long do we stay? I mean, if that church changes, if it's no longer what it once was, if the reasons for which we joined are no longer exist, we can leave. That is different in the kind of church that we're talking about here. So a national church usually has parishes, and parishes means that you are a member of a local congregation based on the geographic location, based on your address, basically. You live on this street, and therefore you go to this congregation. And so that also means that the ethos of belonging to a church is differently. Like it's kind of a given, right, where you belong. Secularization has meant that has started to unravel, because if the church becomes emptier and emptier, that parish structure you can no longer maintain in a way that we are struggling with closing churches. right? This is even stronger in that kind of a context. And so about 7, 8 years ago, the Protestant church in the Netherlands said, we have to give up on the parish system. The ethos is still like you belong to a church, not because you chose to, but because you belong to this, you're called to be part of this community. But we can no longer guarantee that every street has a parish that you belong to. And that's another sense of loss that people experience, because this is how they knew how church worked, and now it doesn't anymore. For the rest, I mean, the Protestant church in the Netherlands is what we would call Presbyterian Reformed church. And so in that sense, the PCUSA and the Protestant church in the Netherlands are sister churches. They're part of the same ecumenical worldwide bodies because of that similar family tradition.
Yeah, but I mean, very different in terms of, I just think about around my area right here, there are a number of churches that are relatively close, but people often go from this area to other areas, or come from, even here we talk about it, come up from across the river to come to churches up here.
Right.
So that's very interesting that in some ways, because of secularization and the loss of having a church in every community, it's what I hear you saying is that it's sort of gaining some of that same quality in terms of people have to search for even if they know I'm going to go to the national church, right? They still have to search out which is the one that's actually in my community now.
Exactly. And so that raises questions about, right, what does it do to a local community when the church closes? I mean, in that kind of parish system, the church is often really the center of the community. I mean, visibly, right? You go to a town and the church is right in the market square. When that church disappears, it's not just a loss of church life, but it's a loss of what held that community together. And so there are all kinds of questions about, and I think we will get to that, like the church saying, maybe we should not do that. Maybe we should try to maintain that presence within a church, even though there is not enough for a congregation to be there. But there is something about that space that is a recognizable place where people have met God for many centuries. Maybe we need to maintain that kind of a presence in a community. And I think there are, even though it is differently structured in this country, there are similar questions in our context.
No, definitely. So I wonder, we've been using words like secularism and, in the title of this, post-Christian. What does that mean? What is a post-Christian world? And then maybe can you talk a little bit about how does that express itself? How did that arise in the Netherlands specifically?
Sure. So probably the term that people might be more familiar with is the idea of post-Christendom. When we talk about post-Christendom, we talk about the kind of things that actually have in this country find expression in culture wars. So the fact that the church no longer has the political or cultural clout, right? Fights about blue laws, fights about church prayer in school, right? The Ten Commandments in the courtroom, these kind of things. And so when we talk about Christendom, we talk about that kind of an established role of the church within the culture and in the structures of power in a society. And definitely, I think we all can feel how that is changing in this country, but in most Western countries. But when we talk about post-Christian, we talk about something actually that we think goes deeper. We're talking about the fact that the Christian faith, but often any kind of religious faith, is increasingly implausible or irrelevant to many people's lives. That simply it doesn't speak to them anymore. It doesn't mean anymore. It doesn't shape their lives, and people for whom that holds do not actually experience that as a loss. They find happiness and things that give meaning to their lives in very different places. Um, Charles Taylor, who is a philosopher who thinks about those about those things, he talks about in a post-Christian world, people live what he calls in the immanent frame. Only the things that are visible to our senses are that what appeal to us, that we connect to. Anything that we feel is transcendent, anything that is beyond that, we post people who live in a post-Christian world, they don't have access to that. And our sense is that when it comes to secularization, right, that idea that religious faith, Christian faith, just isn't relevant to people's lives anymore. That's the kind of phenomenon that we're talking about. And how that comes about, usually not in people someday get up in church and say, I don't believe this anymore, and walk out, right? It doesn't come about in people say, suddenly having a whole lot of intellectual arguments against Christian faith that makes them say, and this doesn't make any sense. And so, right, they suddenly become atheists. No, it is a process that goes very, very slowly. We talked with a pastor in the Netherlands who said that the people who asked to have their names removed from the membership roll, they actually often left 10 years ago already. They still were sitting in your church pews. They still were participating, but in reality, they had left. And that actually leaving the church as in no longer being a member is the last step of a very long journey. I think in this country, we've experienced something of that in COVID, right? Where when church services stopped, when people no longer had the regular rhythm of going to church, once we started again, we saw that we had lost a number of people. And it's not that those people suddenly lost their faith in right a year of or 18 months of the pandemic. It's more like their ties to the church were already very frayed. And it was the fact that they stepped out of that rhythm of going to church every Sunday made them realize, hey, this is actually not that important to me. I mean, right? And it's also not necessarily that at that point people have lost faith. I mean, often when you interview them, when you talk to them, you'll find that they say, oh, I still believe in God and I still read Sunday, I still read the children's Bible to my children or anything like that. But then if those kind of practices are not upheld by a community or by a real weekly rhythm, those practices slowly start to disappear too, exactly because deep down, those things do not feel as that important to people's lives. So it's that phenomenon that we're talking about, the slowly disappearing of the plausibility, right, of the relevance, it becoming just feeling more and more, is it implausible? Is it really the case that? And then it's slipping out of people's lives. And so the question for a church in a post-Christian context is, so how do you relate as a Christian community? How do you communicate the gospel to people who find themselves in that place?
Yeah, I think what in you're speaking to, right, the sort of post-COVID reality is something that we're still trying to come to grips with. Right? I think sometimes in our churches here, we speak about, well, how do we reconnect with those people? How do we get them to come back? And what you're saying seems to suggest that it's not necessary. Now they're just physically gone. They may have been sort of in their lives, in their heart of hearts, I might say, were absent, but there was something that was so, whether it was a habit or just that they liked the people or something like that. And this gave them the means to gracefully sort of make that a reality in
Exactly.
their lives.
And the scary thing about that is, of course, that so if those people have left at the end of a long journey, then that means that the people who are now in your pew are also somewhere on that journey, right? The people who left physically are the people for whom, right? They passed the 50% mark, and this was the moment when they said, "Oh, I think I'm going to leave now." But a good number of people in your pew, maybe somewhere at 35% and 45%, right? And so, in that sense, church membership numbers can be really tricky because they cover the fact that people are in different places when it comes there to how plausible and relevant is this story of the gospel truly to their lives.
So then, coming off of that, another. It also suggests that the work, the missional work, is not just out there, right? But it's also in here, in terms of inside the walls of the church.
Yeah. So when we talk about post-Christendom, when you talk about those culture wars, right, it's very easy to say us versus them. Like the culture no longer wants to be Christian, right? People no longer want to this, that, and the other, right? But when it comes to that question of how relevant and how plausible is the gospel truly to your lives, when you think about this, the fact that what you live in this immanent frame and you have a hard time finding the door to the transcendent. You have a hard time finding access to God. That's a reality that also pertains to people within the church. We all swim in a way in a post-Christian culture, and some of us, right, are more shaped by it than others. But so post-Christian realities obtain as much inside the church as outside of the church, which is why I think these kind of conversations are so important.
So now as we sort of shift to maybe talking about specifics, in terms of the conversations that you have of the church in the Dutch context, I wonder, maybe we start sort of big picture, as you engaged ministry leaders, ministry church contexts, what were some of those maybe broad stroke characteristics of their missional approach in this post-Christian society in which they live? What are some of those maybe broad characteristics, general characteristics that you saw across their missional strategies?
So yeah, so right, in a way, the question is how then do you reach out to those post-Christian neighbors, right? And how do you engage those kind of dynamics? And so when we talked with folks, one image that came up pretty frequent was the image of the court of the Gentiles. So right, remember the temple in Jerusalem, which if you were to look at the temple, it was basically, it had this center, the holy, the place where God was thought to be living in the midst of God's people. And then around that, you had these concentric circles. You had the court for the men, the Jewish men, you had the court for the Jewish women. And around that, you had the court for the Gentiles. And this was the place where, well, probably people like you and I, people who are not Jewish, were allowed, right, to come close to the sanctuary, as it were. They couldn't go into the inner space, but it's a space where Gentiles were allowed, but also if you were a Jew and you wanted to go to the temple, you had to move through the court of the Gentiles in order to get to the temple. So the court of the Gentiles was, as it were, a place where everybody met. And also when you read the gospel stories about some of the teaching that Jesus did at the temple, when you read those stories carefully, it really seems that Jesus was actually teaching in the court of the Gentiles and right, not in the other circles. And so what we heard pastors and congregations say as they were trying to imagine what is it that we now have to do, is they were talking about trying to build a court of the Gentiles that is trying to create a space that was adjacent to the church, adjacent to the Christian community, but where where going into the sanctuary, the threshold would be too high for post-Christian folks to try to create a space around it where, um, where post-Christian folks could still come close to the sanctuary, right? And where there was a meeting space for those who belong to the Christian community and those who were not. But then further, and I think these are some of the examples we'll talk about, where what they were trying to do is to take practices, um, artifacts from the Christian life, from Christian liturgy, from Christian worship, practices and artifacts that had been life-giving to the Christian community, things that had helped him to meet God. They were taking that and putting it in the court of the Gentiles, as it were, putting it on the missional edge of the church. And so, in a way, all the interviews in the podcast, if you were to listen, are about particular ways in which a particular local congregation or a particular practice takes something that you would normally expect to be only in the inner sanctuary, that would only be there for the people of the church, and putting it in a place where it becomes accessible to those outside of the church, and where they were trusting that the same life-giving experience that they had received through engaging this practice would also be now available to those outside of the church. So I think we probably need to give a couple of examples of what that looks like.
Yeah, so but first, just to clarify, right? You're not saying building a literal space that is
Yes,
adjacent
no.
to. It's
No,
more
it's a metaphor.
a metaphor for practices, or as it's taken shape in the Netherlands, particular practices, or like you said, artifacts maybe from the past, maybe from the culture in some ways, and bringing that and using that as maybe another word is like a touchstone for people to make without saying, well, you need to come into service on Sunday. That might be a bridge too far for folks, but just a little touchstone that might begin that journey closer,
Right.
or maybe that's the entire journey, but still having an experience of proximity to the holy.
Right.
So then, I think that pivots right into some of those practices. Is there anywhere that you would like to begin in that?
Sure. Well, I mean, the first one that you highlighted for us was church buildings as connection point with the holy. We talked with Rosaline Israel, who is former Secretary General of the Protestant Church in Amsterdam. And she does research on new monastic communities, and herself was a part of a new monastic community for some time. But this, this is interesting given what you just said about, it's not creating a physical space as the court of the Gentiles, but kind of a fluidity of practices and engagement. In our conversation with her, there was a lot about the power and impact of the church buildings as people, even without belief, unchurched people enter into those spaces. She talked a lot about her time as Secretary General of walking alongside congregations as they were maybe merging with other congregations, and one or the other would have to close their building. And just the weight and the trauma of having to say goodbye to a space, a place that was so deeply meaningful to them. And that cause, they created a position, a pastor to these transitional moments in the lives of congregations to walk alongside of them in that, and started to really develop a different view of church buildings, right? Of course, we know the church is the people, right? We can sing the children's song, and it is the Christ gathering of Christ's people into community, and it's not actually the building, and yet there's something about these sacred spaces where God's people have gathered for maybe generations, and encountered something of the holy there, encountered something of transcendence, that still maintains even for people who maybe aren't seeking out some sort of engagement with the transcendent. And I don't know, I think we're still wrestling with this, what that means for kind of a physical space to hold holiness or to access transcendence. But in the sense, I think of, cathedrals that are, and the inspiration and the faith that went into imagining and constructing this edifice to glorify God, right? There's something there. And then communities have gathered in that space and encountered the holy in some way. We talked about, almost as if the prayers of God's people over the generations somehow seep into the walls and still impact future generations that enter into that space. And not sure exactly how that works and what's happening there, but there's something, and there are people that engage in those spaces recount some experience. And so, whereas we talk a lot in the US about just all that goes into maintaining a church building and keeping the lights on and paying the bills and maintenance and what have you. And well, maybe it would be better if we get rid of the building and we can just go be the church out in the world or in a third space or something. They're really thinking about those buildings as resources that we can engage more fully or differently. And so how can we invite people into this space? So this was from a previous trip, but we went to one church where they have a library in the church building, but like actually in the sanctuary, and actually, if I remember rightly, like in the chancel. And they had cushions set up and like kind of seating areas in the chancel. And so throughout the week, people could come in and get a cup of coffee or a cup of tea and sit and read in the chancel. And just experience the space. Or another church that does like monthly movie nights, and they'll show any movie, it's fine, and people from all around town come to these movie nights. And I remember hearing a story from one of the pastors that there was a man who had been coming to these movie nights all this while and wasn't a part of the church, didn't believe in God, but he had a terminal diagnosis, and so he came to the pastor asking that the pastor do his funeral. Right? This was a connection point for him. And so just the way that it can kind of transform, or open up, like you said, a touch point for people to experience something of the transcendent, even while they maybe can't place their finger on what exactly they're encountering.
So it seems like, almost the American approach to our church buildings is American Protestant approach to our church buildings is sort of the approach of, well, if we can't use it well for churchy things, then we need to shed it, because the only intrinsic value it has is in its ability to facilitate successful churchy things. Whereas what you're saying is that maybe the space in some way, though this pushes up against our sort of instinct towards desacralization of church buildings, coming from a Protestant tradition, right? But that there's some quality to a church building that may facilitate a contact point with the divine, even if they can't put a name on it. And that we should be seeking that out, not necessarily sort of I don't know if reverse utilitarian or utilitarian approach is the right word, but does that sound
Yeah, well, I think as Edwin was saying, in the parish model, that the church is physically the church building is physically at the center of the town or neighborhood, and so that even if the people living around that church building are not engaging in the congregational life of the church, but there's still a symbol there of something that is physically at the center of the community. And that's less so in our context. And yeah, I mean, as I think about driving around Pittsburgh, there are so many church buildings that there's still some nod to some kind of access point or reference to the transcendent that we encounter.
Mhm. So really thinking, place is just as important can be just as important in facilitating that as people that are gathered there in one moment.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I see plenty of congregations in this country who are willing to, let's say, make the space of their buildings available for other kind of activities, right? And in that way, build relationships with the neighborhood and so on. And I mean, and that's all great. But I think what is specific about this is to say we're not just treating our church plant as a facility that can be used by secular groups, but we're treating it as a sacred space, but we're trusting that that space will speak, if treated as such, even to secular people, right? And so now, as Kendra said, I think as Protestants we don't really have a theology for that, right? I mean, we so emphasize that church is people and not a building, but in the lived theology of people, there actually is something there.
Hmm.
And I think you see that when a church building has to close and where suddenly people are coming out of the woodworks, right, who's saying, but my grandma was buried from here, right? Or who feel like there is even if they never go to that sanctuary, they feel like there is a loss when their community no longer has a church.
Hmm.
And so maybe what the Dutch church is doing is leaning into that experience and using that space as itself a missional outpost to try to create a connection, just through the building.
Hmm. Hmm. And as I've listened to the podcast, there've been unique ways of doing that.
Mm-hmm.
But and this is sort of skipping down a little bit, but one of the most unique ones that I sort of gleaned was that use of the church and art, beauty, the practice of choral evensong
Yes.
in the English choral evensong in the Dutch church. So maybe you can talk about that
Yeah.
story.
So that is so as I said, the Protestant church in the Netherlands is a Reformed church, right? Has a Reformed liturgy. Um, Sober, focused on preaching, sacrament once a month, if that, these kind of things, right? The pastor in the black robe. Um, but Dutch people are also Anglophiles, and so they go on vacation often to England, which is right across the North Sea, right? And they encountered their choral evensong. And choral evensong, for those of you not familiar with this is part of the Anglican tradition. It's mostly in Anglican cathedrals and colleges, where every evening around 5, 6, there is a sung liturgy consisting mostly of psalms. They have these often boys choirs, although now it has branched out to also mixed choirs and girls choirs. It's a particular quality of music. Um, and in England itself, these services are still hugely popular. So it's every evening, right? Still hugely popular. And research has shown that it also attracts lots of secular people who just feel that something speaks to them there. Now, Dutch people discovered this, said, we want this too. And so they started boys' choirs in the Netherlands. The in England, the choirs are dressed up in particular choir robes. So Dutch people started to imitate those choir robes. They started to imitate the whole liturgy. Like part of the liturgy is you pray for right in the English king or queen. They took this to the Netherlands, and so even though we at the time had a queen, we were all praying for the king. And so there is clearly something just culturally about it. But in the last 20 years, these services in the Netherlands, they often are done in some of the old cathedrals, right? So the Protestant Church in the Netherlands has cathedrals that they inherited from before the time of the Reformation, right? These very old church buildings. They're not done every night. They're often done maybe once a month or every couple of months. But people have started to come to these in large numbers. And a friend of mine who we interviewed has done her dissertation work on this, and her research showed that about a third of the visitors to these services are people who come from those very traditional Reformed backgrounds who just find that their own liturgy is too somber, too sober, right? Doesn't feed their longing for beauty and aesthetics. A third comes from a very broad ecumenical background, but a third comes from completely secular background, right? Has no connection with the church whatsoever. Goes to these services that are made up basically of Bible verses that are being sung, right? Of psalms, of Bible text. The creed is usually said, prayers are being said, and they report that they have an experience of something that lifts them beyond themselves, of an experience with the transcendent, and an experience of, they don't call it God because God falls out of their imagination in a way, but right, something touches them. And so what my friend actually has done is she has started what we would call a new worshiping community, right? So a church plant connected to these services in Utrecht, which is one of the towns. And so what she does is after the service, she invites people to come with her to the pub, because that is also what you do in England. You go to the pub after evensong. And she invites them, she engages them into a conversation around usually like one of the psalms that they have been singing, right? And so she reads the psalm with them and she has a conversation. So, what is going on here, right? And so she tries to draw them deeper into this experience that they just had. So this is, I think, when I said, so what they're trying to do is, what the Dutch church is trying to do is it is trying to take practices or artifacts from the Christian tradition that the church in the course of centuries has experience of life-giving. Now, the two things that we just talked about are examples of that, right? They take a church building, and rather than it just being open on Sunday morning and being only there for the people within the church, they try to open it and make it available for unchurched folks, so that that building that has been life-giving to the Christian community now can also speak to those who are unchurched. And they're trusting that the building will say something, that the building will somehow mediate the presence of God. With evensong, this practice that has been part of the Anglican tradition for 500 years, they're offering it to this post-Christian audience, trusting that participation in this practice will somehow communicate something of the goodness of the gospel. And it does. And it's not supposed to happen, right? According to the theories about secularization. I mean, secular people only live in the immanent frame. They can't find the door to the transcendent. Well, somehow the transcendent found them. And that's right. That's what we're talking about.
Right. So even a practice like evensong, which, we church people might initially look at and say, wow, that's like a big leap to go from like somber, sort of pared down Reformed worship to then go to this really. And if I remember correctly, it's not like even updated English. It's like the King James traditional English sort of service. So going from for us, that seems like a big leap.
Mhm.
They're saying that there's something in that, something in the beauty, both in the beauty of the space and in the beauty of the words, the music, that even though that may be a big leap, it's almost as if it's big enough that it becomes relatable again, or it
Yes.
becomes uh, permeable again.
Right.
That's
Right.
interesting.
I really like that you just said that, Noah, because I think, I do think a lot in our context, we try to um, kind of pave over the stumbling blocks
Mm,
to Christianity, and as we're trying to make it palatable and then wrap it into this plausibility structure of folks outside the church, and what we've found so much in the Netherlands and in these conversations is exactly what you're naming, like this trust in the practices, trust in the traditions of the church that have been meaningful to generations of Christians, of Christ's people. And maybe we don't have to apologize for that. Maybe we can trust that they still have power. And that's so different from what people outside the church are encountering, or even a lot of people within the church, right? That it becomes a new entry point for them.
mm.
You should talk about the confessional as another example.
Oh, yeah, I think this was one of my favorite conversations, but we talked with Peter Versloot, who's in a medieval church, again, one of these large churches in the center of town, and he talked about what Edwin was talking about earlier, kind of the elusive nature of the impact of secularization, and that people really have left the church about 10 years before they've actually left the church. I think he said in life and heart. And then COVID gave them an excuse, or their friends started leaving, or what have you. And he named this kind of hopelessness and powerlessness around that, of just kind of watching people slip away. And so then and he had this phrase about, he talked about scratching where it doesn't itch,
Hmm.
and kind of the disconnect between church leadership and what they're proclaiming and what they're doing, and what actually is the itch, like what people are really looking for and hungry for. And so he had this experience with a spiritual director of his that had a great experience with confession, and invited Peter into that, and Peter really appreciated it, and so he ended up bringing that practice to his church, the confessional, which again is not a part of the Reformed tradition so much, and so because their church is situated right in the center of the city, uh, on the nights when kind of the shopping district is open and people are shopping, he puts out what he calls the trail of lights. And so it's luminaries that are kind of leading a pathway into the church. And then the church, the lighting is dim. And so he talked about a sense of security and anonymity. And so people feel safe to enter into that space. Like they might be there, but they won't necessarily be seen by their friends because it's dark, right? But they can listen to music and look at the artwork, and then if they want, they can have a conversation with the pastor, and he invites them to just tell their story and unburden themselves of whatever they've been carrying. And he started advertising this in the newspaper and all over the place, and secular kind of media, and people come from all over the country now to engage this. But he, again, it's so far outside of their experience, and what I really appreciated hearing him talk about it is that he's completely unapologetic about his beliefs, but open to whatever they're willing to engage. And so he invites them into the confessional booth, and he offers them a cup of tea or coffee because it's easier when you have a warm beverage in your hands, he says. And he again invites them to tell their story, whatever they've been carrying that they might want to unburden themselves of. And he names for them that they're, you and I are together in this space, but I believe that we're not alone. There is a third, that Christ is with us, and no assumption that they should believe that, or even invitation for them to believe it, but just a naming that this is a truth for him, that he holds. And then he listens to their stories, and then he sometimes, depending on the situation, will engage in one of the traditional liturgies of absolution. And he prays with them, and then he always prays for the people that he's met with the next morning. He makes that a part of his regular practice as well. And he says, this might be the only time that I see them. That might be the one time, which was another common thread, I think, of that trust, that it's and patience. I think so often we put a lot of responsibility on our own shoulders, and we want to see results of those efforts right away, and can become discouraged when we don't think that we're seeing results or success or what have you. But trusting that when we open that space and we open that connection and we enter into that with someone else, that God can work through that, and it can be meaningful even still, even if they don't immediately sign up for church membership, right?
Right. So in some ways, reworking our what is a successful ministry interaction, or we always think it has to be a step which leads to church membership or to butts in the pew, but it may be that a single act in itself can make an impact in somebody's life. What's really interesting to me about that is, you talk about the Netherlands being a highly individualistic society, much like the US in some ways, but even maybe more so. But that even in that, they're willing to come to him and basically almost spill their guts about their life, about what they're going through, not just keep it to themselves. And that there's something cathartic about that they don't know him at all, or maybe they do know him tangentially, but it's not just I need to keep this from, I need to keep my sort of being intact, but I'm actually willing to share that in this particular environment.
Well, and what he is doing, right? He doesn't invent anything new, right? I mean, this is not. We know in this very different context, and so we need to come up with very different ways. He reaches for something that, well, his and our Presbyterian tradition actually doesn't really use in this way, but that, of course, has been part of the Christian tradition for centuries, right? It just is there. And so he just reaches for something that is there and offers it. And as Kendra said, is completely unapologetic about the particularity of the Christian interpretation of it, right? It's not like some vague, like, well, somebody may be, Christ is here in our midst. I declare to you absolution. Right? It's very particular, very Christian, nothing new. And for the last 10 years, people have been coming from everywhere just to go through, just to have the opportunity for this conversation.
No, that's right. Well, and I picture in my head, what would a confessional in our country look like if there was beverages served? Or I think about, I watch the BBC Father Brown, and it's a priest who solves crimes, and I wonder about the confessional if there was tea involved and what that would look like. So,
well, maybe you first need to start solving crimes and then see what happens.
Yeah. That, yes. So we've drilled down into some practices, but maybe I want to take a step back again, look at bigger picture, and to ask, what are sort of the modes of discernment that you noticed in these ministry leaders? because, it's one thing to say, well, they were just picking up these practices, but it's not like it was a prescribed practice or that it worked in the same way in every, not every church, Protestant church was taking up the confessional. Not every church was taking up evensong. There was something particular about their own discernment in seeing what was happening in their community. So as you looked at that sort of broader scope, what was the sort of approach to discernment? What were some of the maybe key features in their processes as you talked to them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if I try to think about this, it is very contextual. So, right, the use of buildings, I mean, it kind of depends on whether you have a building that can be used in that way, right? And not everybody has that. I'm thinking about this other story of a pastor in Amsterdam who, Amsterdam is ground zero for secularization, but it's also there are highly educated people in Amsterdam, and so they, even though they have no interest in becoming a Christian, they still want to know the Bible stories because they want to understand the paintings of Rembrandt and Van Gogh, and right, and so they come to the pastor and say, "You're a specialist in that stuff. Can you tell us some Bible stories?" And he decided to actually use this opportunity to create a Bible study in which he invited those folks and people from his own church. So there would be a Bible study in which, secular folks and church folks together would read scripture. Now, this in a way comes forth out of the context, right? The fact that there are those people in Amsterdam who ask these kind of questions, and he tries to what does he do? He doesn't say, let me create a course for unchurched people. No, he says, let's have a Bible study, because that's what the Christian church has done for centuries, right? They are asking for something about the Bible, and he responds by pulling out a Christian practice and putting it in front of them. Right? With this evensong, well, it starts with people who are Anglophiles, right? And who are interested in acting British. And so the church took this opportunity to engage that. So I think the discernment is probably the deep reflection on the particular context in which you find yourself, and then trusting in what has been life-giving to the church through the centuries. In other words, that what God has been using through the centuries as being still life-giving, but offering it in such a way that it really is on the missional edge of the church. So as I said, with this confessional, there is no expectation you become a member of the church, right? It's not like they walk out of the church and he gives them a card, right? But and here's some information about our church and our programs. And no, you trust in the rite itself, and you trust that God will be using that rite the way that God has been using it in the past. And so that willingness to give up on the control over the process, right? Willingness to say, I'm not just going to keep this practice for us, but I'm offering it for whoever seems to be interested in engaging. And then I'm leaving it to God to see what happens. I think.
Yeah, but specifically after having listened, like that's where that like scratching where it doesn't itch, like that really resonated for me, because it's not in a manipulative way or a pushy way, right? That's coming out of trusting these practices and traditions, but finding the entry points by listening to and observing the context and the people around you. And so what are the things that, okay, people are interested in the scripture stories because they want to understand the paintings. That's something I can engage. How can we engage that, right? Or people are carrying these things around. Well, the church has a practice for that, for unburdening ourselves, right? And so paying attention to context and listening well while trusting in these practices and the God to whom we've related through these practices for generations, right? And finding the connection points, I think is the key.
And so I think similarly, the goal with our podcast is not to say to the American church, here are some things you should be copying, right? Because that would be the non-contextual way of approaching it, but more to say, yeah, like the question that you just asked. So what is the discernment process that goes into that? So what, right? How might you all, as you think about your context, right? What might be the ways in which in that context you may take something from the Christian heritage and put it on that missional edge? And that may look completely different from congregation to congregation, just like it looks really different in the Netherlands from congregation to congregation.
Right, and being aware that context is that the place where we're at is important. And the people whom we may already be in interaction with in our community may have something to say, right? Or maybe the vehicle through which God is saying, oh, it's in this direction. It's in this, even if it's not something that's typically churchy necessarily.
Well, but I do think, if I think about the missional conversation in this country and what we observed in the Netherlands, that I think lots of missional conversation in this country is about inviting congregations to build renewed relationships with their neighborhood and so on, which makes a lot of sense, right? Lots of congregations have lost touch with the neighborhoods because they have become insular or because the neighborhood has changed from what it once was, and right, all good and well. But often what we're trying to do in those things is we basically are trying to do now the church is trying to do non-churchy things with non-church people. But what you see here is that the church is trying to do churchy things with non-church people, right? And that's different.
Yeah.
And I think in the end, right? And in the end, they do that because they feel that there is life in those churchy things. But how do you do it in such a way that it is not about just making people members of your congregation, but to offer that life that the Christian church has found in those practices to those outside of the church?
No, that's an interesting pivot. Like having confidence again in our own selves. I mean, in a sense, our own practices, and that's what you've been saying throughout. Well, I'm cognizant of the time, so I'd love to turn it over to any questions that anybody has as you've listened to this. Again, feel free to send them to me in chat, or use a raise hand function, or physically raise your hand of any question you might have for Kendra and Edwin. And I'll just say to the Hebron folks who are here, who are the Anglophiles, maybe we can pick up on this evensong thing.
Start with going to the pub and see what happens.
Okay, Scott Parks.
Is it on?
Yes.
Am I on?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So, quick question. The advent of online streaming for church, we scrambled to get online during COVID, and then we thought, we would encounter dozens, if not hundreds, of people beating down our doors. What is your thoughts on the hope or promise or lack thereof of that in today's church?
You don't have that.
Your church does that, so.
No, we do. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of thoughts on the live streaming. I think that there has been a lot of hope that and imagination that, being live streaming online means that we can reach people all around the world and we'll all be part of one church and kind of draw people together. I think I think that that disregards some of the embodied nature of the church and the importance of caring for one another in embodied community. And so we're now recognizing the challenges with what we might have hoped for. And I think that having there is opportunity to reach different people with our services live streamed. I think that personally, I experience as a church leader a discomfort given my take of kind of the embodied in the moment nature of worship. And so having them kind of captured on YouTube for all eternity feels, I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it, I
Yeah,
guess.
I hear you. I hear you.
I mean, I think it works great to stay in touch with those folks from your congregation who cannot
Yes.
physically,
Yeah.
right, make it,
Yeah.
or otherwise. I mean, I get to hear Kendra preach when she preaches in her church. It's not my church, and so that works great. But if we talk about the people we're talking about here, like the right post-Christian folks for whom Christian faith is irrelevant or implausible, they're not going to search for an online church service, right? I mean, I mean, like, that falls under the same kind of category of videos of flat earthers and all kinds of other, right, interesting things you can find on the internet, but you're not going to waste your time on for that category of people, right? So if you want to reach that category of people, I think it has to be a different kind of conversation.
I do, to that point though, I do think that there is a small opportunity that if you are in conversation with someone, if you're building relationship with someone somewhere out in the world at the pub or what have you, and are able to build a relationship enough that they get some curiosity, that can be a safe avenue for them to engage in some way. And I don't know that, to our earlier conversation about the kind of the power of church buildings and the gathering of community, they're still not, they're really just distanced observers when they're watching on a screen from that perspective. They likely will not experience the kind of holiness and transcendence or won't be as open to that experience as they would be if they were in the space. But it may well be an entry point.
We have a question from Nancy. Nancy writes, America is a country that is distanced. We are isolated in a way because we drive great distances to church, so we can easily isolate. COVID encouraged that distancing from the church, and people take their children to worship. People take their children to worship at the soccer field on Sunday. So we don't easily have people wander in for a confessional, say. So how do we deal with distance as an isolator?
Well, I think that's true, and that's certainly a cultural difference with the Netherlands, where, right, everything is much closer to each other, and many more people live in walkable neighborhoods and so on than in the States, where, right, so many people live in suburbs and you have to drive anywhere to get anywhere. So I think that is a real difference. I would say that's exactly where the contextual question comes in, right? This is why we're not saying like copy these kind of things. I mean, if that's how your context is shaped, how do connections formed otherwise, and what are the ways in which you can lean into that reality, right? I mean, even people in the suburbs, they meet other people. So where do they meet other people? And how is can the church be a presence in the particular way in which we're trying to describe it, so as to invite unchurched people to do churchy things with, right? So yeah, I think that really depends from on your own context, I mean, how to engage in these kind of things.
So Carol is voicing in conversation with this, she's saying, I'm thinking we need to go out instead of having folks come to us. And I'm thinking about a recent request from a local high school football team for pre-game meal support. So that's in our context here. So how much is it going out and doing maybe churchy things in their in their sort of space? If where my church is here, right, we're sort of distanced because we're rural, going to those places where other people are and maybe doing those churchy things there.
Yeah, and I would say maybe going to those other places where people are and first listening and engaging and building relationship and hearing what are the things in people's hearts, what are their wonderings, what are their cravings and desires and needs, and then beginning to imagine and discern how the church engages that further.
So I mean, the example that was given about the providing meals, I mean, that I put in the category of rebuilding relationships.
Yeah.
Whereas at some places the church has lost those, right, or otherwise, and I think you need that in order to do what Kendra was just talking about, right? I mean, you can't hear what is in people's hearts unless you have some kind of relationship where you have access to that.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I mean, that's not yet the life-giving, these are not yet the life-giving practices of the gospel, right? And so how do we then indeed can hear what is going on in people's hearts and then start to imagine, so how to connect them to some of these practices that the church has found to give grace in life.
Right, because what you're not saying in your whole conversation here is not, well, we need stop doing those reconnecting things, stop doing those have secular folks come and use the church building. But you're saying that there's another layer which has confidence again in the churchy stuff that might speak to those very people that are already maybe using your space or you're already in contact with or could be in contact with.
Right. And this is also, I mean, this is a secularization, and so post-Christian realities obtain in very different ways in different contexts, right? I mean, whether you in this country, I mean, and it's certainly in this country, which is so diverse in all kinds of ways, but whether you live, let's say, in Oregon, or you live in the Bible Belt in the South, right? Or you live in, right? Secularization looks completely different in any of those. I'm convinced that secularization is obtaining in all those differences, but in where we are on the trajectory and how it's shaping people, and what generations that it is shaping looks really different from place to place. And that is where it's actually really important to be in contact with your context. So you have a realistic picture of how that looks like where you're located as a Christian community. And so how you will be engaging will look different in any of these contexts.
So I think we have time for just one more question. If anybody has a question, or I of course have a question, but I'm opening it up for folks. So you've already touched on this a little bit, but what are some of those missional postures that the church in the U.S. can learn specifically from the Dutch church? So we've talked about being sensitive to context. We've said confidence in our own the own life-giving ability of our Christian practices. But is there anything else that you might add to that that you would want the church to at least learn from in terms of a missional posture?
I mean, I think we've named a lot of it already, but just trust and patience and hope. That again, I think for so many of us right now in the US church context, there is again so much anxiety and wondering and grasping for what once was, and we tend to put then a lot of the onus on our own shoulders to bring that about. And I think that if the future is something in God's hands that is promised, that that we are encouraged, that so long as we're looking toward and trying to reclaim something of the past, that and anxiously trying to recreate, then our attention is drawn away from the one who is in our midst, actually drawing us to whatever God has planned for us.
Amen.
Well, amen, indeed. I think that's a good word to end on. Well, thank you so much, Edwin and Kendra, for your time and for your responses. And thank you, all of you, for coming and joining us in this conversation. I just have a final word. Yes, okay. This webinar is made possible in part by Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. That's, many folks will know, that's where I went. So the mission of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary is participating in God's ongoing mission in the world. PTS is a community of Christ, joining in the Spirit's work of forming and equipping people for ministries familiar and yet to unfold, and communities present and yet to be gathered. They have a number of programs, as you can see, and resources both for degree-seeking folks and non-degree seeking folks. One of those, of course, is the Being Church in a Post-Christian World podcast, or online events for any sort of church leader, continuing education. And if you are in a church context or know a pastor, the Preaching in a Post-Christian Age initiative, Dr. Van Driel is on the steering team for that and teaches in that. So if any of this has been interesting, or you think it'd be interesting to a preacher that you know, send them to PTS. You can find out more at PTS, www.pts.edu. Thank you, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you,
all.
Noah.
Thanks.